Hey everybody, and welcome to another cool Kintone video. My name is Sean. I'm a developer advocate, and today we're going to be talking about using Oauth 2.0 to authenticate web requests and API calls in your web application. And we're going to be using the new Svelte 5 beta in order to do it, just because I wanted to play around with the new runes and see what that was all about. And also, I've done a lot of videos where we just use an API token to add some scopes to it and make some requests, but Oauth 2.0 is a really powerful tool for authentication. And the concepts that we talk about today are actually, we're going to be using Kintone because I work for Kintone, but the concepts that we're going to be talking about today are very applicable to any kind of web service. And lots of different providers of OAuth. You probably see it all the time when you're browsing online. Log in with Google, for example, log in with GitHub, right? That's what we're going to be implementing here today. And also, if you're not a big fan of Svelte, there are some things that using Svelte 5 has made easier to develop, but the concepts are the same. You could do this in React or vanilla JavaScript if you want. So we're going to start out by talking a little bit about what is Oauth 2.0 and why should you use it, for example. And we're also going to talk about how we set up our Kintone app and stuff like that. It's going to be very basic. And then we're going to dive right into the code and let's get some cool authentication going. And what we're going to be making today, oops, I was already logged in. That's what I get for testing my application before I actually start. But we're just going to be making a very simple concept. We have a big button, big red button here. Log in with Kintone. You're going to click it and it says log in actually. Funny. Anyways, we're going to have this login screen come over here and it says, hey, do you want to authenticate this app to be able to do these kind of actions? And I'm going to allow my app and okay, I'm logged in. Very cool. And I'm going to click this button, get some Kintone records, and it's going to return just some test data from an app that I had lying around. And you'll see that we get this record data as well. How is this different from anything that we normally do? Actually, we did not use any API tokens here, which is cool in my opinion. But yeah, that's what we're going to be making today, and I hope you enjoy. Yeah, so first I just want to talk a little bit about, what is 2.0, right? Don't worry about Oauth 1.0, right? Everything's about 2.0. It's a protocol or a set of guidelines for how to handle user authentication and granting of permissions to perform certain actions in different web apps, right? And it's a little bit difficult to, quote unquote, people say it's difficult to implement yourself. But what that means is to actually implement the handling of user data and security, right? A lot of people will say, don't roll your own auth. Don't do it. Don't try and do your own auth. And they're correct. But what that means is you don't have to use like a third-party service or, a package or a framework or something like that. What it means is don't try and write your own OAuth implementation of the protocol, right? You can use Oauth to authenticate in your web app. Use Google authentication, for example, or GitHub or Facebook, or in this case, we're going to be using Kintone Oauth authentication in order to authenticate users, right? Make sure that they're actually users in our Kintone environment. You can see right here, I'm going to show you my administration screen. And you can see I have myself right here, Sean, I'm in there. And then I have a username and a password and all this kind of login information. I also have permissions, right? I have certain apps and certain databases that I'm allowed to see, some that I'm not. Some of these apps I'm allowed to look at the records. Some of them I can add records, right? And by using Oauth for Kintone, and then also using that Oauth token to perform actions within Kintone, you automatically get all the permissions that a user has. So you can imagine if you have a huge organization, right, with hundreds and hundreds of users, then it would be a pain in the butt, right, to manage API tokens for each user, right, and like who can do what. In fact, I think it's pretty much impossible, right? Whereas here, just normal users of your platform, in this case, it's Kintone, right? When you add a user to a certain group or a certain department, then it automatically gives them a certain set of permissions, right? And then maybe they change departments, and then it automatically, by using Oauth, we don't have to do anything in our code base or like managing API tokens in order to have them, be updated to the latest scopes that they're allowed to use. That's a really powerful tool, in my opinion. If you're looking just for authentication, right? If you're looking for just, I want to make sure that this user is a valid user, You didn't have to use Kintone OAuth. You could use like Google, for example, or any other service, right? But since we're using Kintone as a database in this project, and I'm already a user, it makes sense, right? We can use the Kintone OAuth token then to make API requests to our database, right? You could probably do something similar probably with Google and Firebase. I'm sure all the major providers have some kind of a built-in solution like this, right? It just makes sense. And so for OAuth, you have to go through a couple steps, and I have here the documentation from our website, kintone.dev, right here. And basically, I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. It boils down to these 5 steps, right? What you're going to do first, and here's a cool little image, but it's a little bit hard to understand at first glance, but we're going to be going through it together. First, you're going to do an authorization request. So, hey, I am a valid user of this platform, right? Because you saw earlier, I have an account on my Kintone subdomain. So, right, my OAuth client, aka my web app, my React app, my Svelte app, whatever, is going to make a request via the browser, right? So this is going to be just a fetch request. And it's going to say, hey, I am an actual user. You saw that I had to log in earlier. And Kintone's going to be like, yep, that's the right username and password. I believe you. And it's going to send back an authorization code back to my app. And this is where a lot of people don't understand. You have to make a second request to your OAuth provider, right? And so this is what's going to happen next is our app is going to take that authorization code and then once again make another fetch request for an access token, right? And that access token is what we're going to actually use to be making API requests, right? Because logging someone in as a user, validating their usership is different, right, from having that user actually perform actions, right? And so the OAuth 2.0 protocol separates those concerns. And that's why you have to make 2 API requests, right? So here it is in a bullet point or a number list format, right? Make the authorization request. They say, okay, you're a user, all right. We'll give you this authorization code. You use that authorization code, usually within like a certain amount of time, a minute, 10 minutes. We can check the documentation. Depends on which platform you're using. And we use that authorization code to get an access token. They send back an access token, and then we use that access token to make some API calls to our database or our app, all right? We're going to be using a very simple demo app that I have here. Where is my demo app? I think it's called the product database, right? And I have some like other random tests and stuff that I'm doing here. I had this app lying around, but it's a very simple database. It has a product name, an ID, a price, stuff like that. It has an attachment, but I'm not using it. And if you go into the app settings, here I have an old API token lying around as well, but I'm just gonna get rid of that because I want to show that this app is not using API tokens. So we'll go back to our app, and we're gonna log in with Kintone. That's great. We're logged in now, and then I click on this, and you can see I still get that product data, right? Because we are not using API tokens. If you're interested about what is Kintone or like how do I use it, how do I make databases, how do I make apps in Kintone, we have lots of videos. I'll link to that in the video and in the description as well. And if you want to try things out for free, and I really do mean free, as in we don't sell your personal information to anybody or anything like that. We have this developer license. If you go to kintone.dev/new, N-E-W, or if you click around on our site, you can find it. And this developer license basically lets you use Kintone to test and hack things out. It's a really good deal, in my opinion. Scroll down and just give us a little bit of information and a valid email address so we can make sure you don't, spam creating of domains. And you create your Kintone developer license subdomain, right? Your subdomain name is going to be what comes before .kintone.com. You can see up here, it's very, very small, but I have sean.kintone.com, right? So I put right down in this field, many years ago, I put Sean right here, and it'll probably say, okay, that's not available. This one is available, right? You could do Sean is cool. That's totally fine. A little bit weird, but yeah. Yeah, that's available. Scared me for a minute there. Agree to our terms of service and privacy policy. It basically says don't spam API requests, and you have your own developer license. An email will be sent to the email that you supplied, and the first time that you log in, your login name will be the email that you provided us with, and you'll get asked to make a password and stuff like that. And at the very end, after everything, you'll be greeted with this screen right here, go down to Kintone, and then you can create apps and make your own database as you need. For more information about that, though, please check out our other videos. Covered it many times. It takes 5 minutes to get up and running, which is really cool in my opinion. All right, we're going to be implementing this flow in Svelte 5 using runes, right? It's still in beta, so some things may change, although I assume, even though they say that things are in beta and may change, I don't think there's going to be major changes to what happened in Svelte 5 with what they call runes. It took me a little bit of thinking, or just because I made a lot of Svelte apps in the past with 3 and 4, so I was very used to the Svelte syntax, like export, let my variable equals test. And then I could edit that variable and pass it around as props and blah, 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 right? They'll tell you now, I have here Svelte 5 up and running already, but it'll say, hey, you can't use this in runes mode. That just means Svelte 5. It tells you to use props, for example, or you might notice that there's this $ state, for example. I won't be going into too much the nitty gritty of the new Svelte 5 syntax. There's people that are much, much better at explaining that than I am. But it was interesting to try and use this for the first time. And I'd never really done too much experimentation with Oauth myself. And I've never done experimentation with Svelte 5. So I figured, why not? And if you want to check out this demo app, there will be a link to the GitHub repository as well in the description. So you can clone this and set it up along with me in this video. And you can test it out yourself with your own Kintone subdomain. So we're going to start talking about our app and how it's set up real quick. And I'll kind of talk about the front end. Then I'll talk about the back end and kind of the structure of our app. And I'll show you the place where we actually make the OAuth authentication request. Hint, hint, it's in the auth route, right? Just a big spoiler. And I'll also let me show you a little bit about this project before I really get into things. Here's our package.json. Always a good idea to check that out when you're opening up any new web app, right? And using Vite, I literally just went to Google, I typed in Svelte 5 get started, and I copy pasted the npx create Svelte app or something like that. So I didn't do anything fancy there. And it just has these packages. It has Svelte Kit, because we have our own kind of backend. This stuff here with the plus server, that's backend files, right? They run on the server side, which is necessary for making API calls to Kintone. So keep that in mind. If you're not using Svelte's kit, then, either use that or use some other kind of backend. For example, you can make a backend in Node very easily. Express.js is another very common tool, whatever your preferred backend is. But here we're doing it in Kit just because it's easy. You can see we're on Svelte 5. I tried to install some Tailwind CSS, and also I changed the font just for fun. I don't know why I did that necessarily. In order to install Tailwind, I installed a package. When I did like init Tailwind or something like that, that's also from their documentation. I'm sorry I don't have it memorized, but if you're just getting into web development like this, then that's good news, right? Don't memorize anything, just look it up. I have this config, they're like prefixes. They're plugins that make the Tailwind CSS work. I'm not exactly sure how it works, right? I have my Tailwind config. I added a font. What do you want from me, right? This I did not change. My Svelte config. You do have to enable runes explicitly because Svelte 5 is still in beta. And so you have to go into the compiler options. You have to turn on runes true, right? And that'll turn your application onto runes mode is what they call it. Basically, if you don't want to interact with the new syntax at all right now, you can just use Svelte 5 with your old syntax, right? But since I enabled runes mode here, I couldn't do, for example, export let my variable like I showed you earlier, right? Unfortunately. So I didn't change anything else in here. I didn't even bother to write a README. This is just the default README, right? Let me show you my .env file with all my super secret information, and we'll talk about where I got that information next. How about? We have a couple things here, and we have what's called a client ID, a client secret, a redirect URI, and you're going to see probably these 3 or 4 variables appear in any kind of OAuth 2.0 Flow. We prefixed them with Vite because I'm using Vite as the default Webpack replacement for my application. You have to prefix it with Vite, otherwise you can't use it on the front end apparently. So watch out for that. Anyways, we have this redirect URI. We have our authorization endpoint, right? This is just basically, you could not have this be an M variable, right? It's not secret at all. And we have the token endpoint as well. That's not necessarily a valuable information. I just put it in here for ease of use. And then we also have our Kintone subdomain and the app ID of the app that we want to get data from. And so what is all this information, right? So let's go back real quick to our authorization flow, and let's think about it now. You need to know basically where first to make your authorization request. So that is going to be our authorization endpoint right here, mysubdomain.kintone.com, oauth2/authorization. That's also here in the docs as well. And that is where we're going to be making our fetch request, right? And when we make that fetch request, we also have to send along a little bit of information. It tells you right here, you need to send along your client ID. You need to send along the redirect URI, that's URL, and you need to send along a couple of extra variables for security purposes to make sure that so no one's man-in-the-middling your attack, as they say. No one is hijacking your request and like stealing your token as it's being sent, right? There's a secret state code that you need to send as well. And then you also need to send some scope parameters, right? And we write them like this for Kintone. This is probably different depending on who your OAuth 2.0 provider is. But here we have our app record read, right? That kind of makes sense, right? We want to read, we want to get our app record information later. If you want to add records to your database, you probably need to change this like app record. It's probably add or post or something like that, right? Look it up. You need to send along some of this information though to this OAuth 2.0 endpoint, OAuth 2/authorization, right? So that's why we have that here in our variables. And then we have our redirect URI, we have our secret, and we have our ID. Let's go over where I got those. It's not a huge secret. I'm going to show you my actual .env file, but I just want to talk about concepts first. We have a client ID and a secret. Where do I get these values from, right? So in Kintone, when you want to set up OAuth first, you have to be an administrator, and you have to go to Users and System Administration. And if you scroll down here, you can see like integrations, OAuth, right? And there's a couple of default ones that they have. I have them all enabled because I test various things as part of my job. But here, down here, it says set up advanced services. And what advanced services means is my own web app should be able to authenticate with Kintone, right? I actually have this one enabled right here. So what I did is I went to add OAuth client. And when you click this, you just have to fill in really two different things, and the rest will be provided to you after that. I'll just show you right now. Test for YouTube. Hello, YouTube, right? A logo. You don't really need a logo. The other thing that you need to supply is your redirect endpoints, your redirect URI or your URL, for example. And it tells you right here, jump to this URL after the authorization success in Kintone. Some of them will have two endpoints, like one for success, one for failure, for example. You don't really need that. It is nice to have. But here in Kintone, we just have jump to this URL after the authorization success. And what this is, if we go back to our image, our flow up here, right? And you can see this when in our test app up above as well. I'll show you right after this. We make an authorization request, and I have to log in, right? And the user has to say, okay, do you want to approve this app to be able to do these things? You're asking the user, is it okay? Do you recognize this app doing it? It's not Sean's crypto Bitcoin miner.xyz.com, making a request, right? It's the app that I'm creating, right? So that's very good, right? And then it sends you back to a certain screen, for example. So in this case, I have my redirect URI just set to, I'll get into the nitty gritty of it later, but basically I have it set to my website.com or whatever your app is. Since we're running on localhost, I had to do a little bit of a cool trick, which I'll explain later for kind of people who are following along with the video, just as a cool treat. But in short, I said, hey, when the user authenticates correctly, go back to www.mywebsite.com. That could be mywebsite.com. That could be mywebsite.com/authorization success, or like mywebsite.com/my account, for example, if you're having people like log into their account, for example. Any kind of option, right? So you'll notice right here, right? I click login, and actually you can see the URL up here at the top. If you really squint and zoom in, right, you can see that I've sent a lot of information to this app right here, right? And I click allow, and it sends me back to, in this case, localhost 5173 or mywebsite.com. That is what it's talking about right there for redirect endpoints. So right now I'm just going to do www.mywebsite.com/my account, sure, whatever, right? That doesn't exist. Maybe it does. Well, someone's sitting on it, but I think we're safe. I think we're safe to do that as an example, right? And the client ID, client secret, endpoints, and token endpoints will all be automatically generated as well. So we click save. It must be starting with HTTPS. Oh, thank you for telling me. And also, that's one reason why I had to do a cool little trick with using localhost, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. So you can see right here, we have test for YouTube. It doesn't have any logo or anything like that. The next thing that you need to do is click on configure users. You need to explicitly say, okay, which users can use this OAuth authentication flow, right? So I'm going to add myself. I'm not going to add my test user here. And you click save, so I should be added to that. And we click one more time just to double check. Yep, I got a check mark, so that's great. You can also add entire departments or groups, which is a very cool feature of Kintone. And it's enabled. And if we click on this little pen mark, you can see that the rest of our super secret information has been filled in for us. We have here a client ID, a client secret that is telling me to keep secure and confidential. Don't worry, I'll be deleting all this after the video is done. And then we have our authorization endpoint and token endpoint as well. So this is where I got this information from in my .env file, right? Here's my client ID. And here is my client secret as well that I'll be sending along with my authentication requests. Yeah, so that's where I got that information from, and we'll talk a little bit about how I use it in a little bit. So I guess now I'll talk about that redirect endpoint shenanigans, as they say. So I am developing locally on my machine right here. And so maybe if you're used to web dev, you spin up a server like npm start or react start or whatever it is, and it opens up your web page on localhost, right? Localhost is, first of all, not connected to the internet, right? It's only on your local network. It's localhost. And by default, right, it does not have HTTPS for that secure HTTP protocol, right? It doesn't need to, right? It's only existing on your machine. Why would you need to secure things in your local network like that? Is the idea. If you really try hard, you can make it so localhost uses HTTPS. I didn't want to do that. Sounds like a big pain in the butt. And what I found online is this cool service called redirectme2.com. And this allows me to basically any website or any thing that I specify after that slash right there, so slash localhost 5173 where my app is running, it will automatically redirect to that address, which my browser knows it exists because it's on my local network. And it'll just send along all the headers, cookies, and any kind of information that was passed to it as it is directly to that redirect address. So it'll send all the information that Kintone is sending back to, first it goes to redirectme2.com, and the redirectme2 says, hey, I'm going to send this over to localhost 5173. So I use this to get around the HTTPS restriction because, you know, it is important that your OAuth applications don't use just unsecure protocols at HTTP, right? It ruins the point because someone could just jump in the middle and be like, hey, it's me, localhost. Give me your tokens, my friend. And localhost.com. localhost.com 3, right? And it'll be like, hey, you're not allowed to do HTTPS, right? So that is what I used to get around this. I use redirectme2.com. And you can, it's a really cool service. Directme2.com. This person is probably running it out of the kindness of their heart, which is very nice of them. It's for testing purposes only, right? Don't use production authentication or anything like that, even if this person seems really nice. But for testing purposes and running locally, which is what we're doing today, just fine. In fact, I was really glad to be able to find this tool to use. Shout outs to Cody Grantham, and definitely check out their GitHub and their other stuff because they made a really useful service, and that's really cool. So anything that you redirect to after that slash, it will just send along all that information, right? They even have it right here, right? I think a lot of people use this service in order to test out OAuth authentication, right? In fact, if you just Google, like, how do I test OAuth on localhost, right? There's lots of different people asking like how to do this, right? My recommendation is just use redirect me to, and then when you finally, your killer cool app using Kintone, OAuth, and Kintone database comes to production, right? And you have your first million users, or you're about to get your first million users, then push to production, and you'll have your own URL, like mywebsite.com, and you can just change the redirect URI to that when you need to, right? You can change this after the fact, and you just have to also update your .env file or any place that you're specifying. This has to match what is registered in Kintone. Yeah. So that is why I'm doing redirectme2.com here. So a cool little trick if you're testing out OAuth, and maybe I'll mention this in the description, stuff like that. Maybe not. Maybe it's just a treat for people who watch my videos in the middle, right? You never know. All right. So I've talked a little bit about what we're doing here and our kind of how to set up OAuth integration. So next we're going to delve into the code, and I'm going to show you exactly how I implemented this flow that we have described right here. Yeah, so let's start talking a little bit more about the code of the application. And I delved in to a little bit of the framework of this basic application that I made earlier. We talked earlier about the package.json, like our dependencies and setup. I have to enable runes mode and your .env file, for example, right? But now I'm going to actually start talking about how the app is structured. Most of it is boilerplate. I didn't app.html, for example, or anything like that. I haven't touched this lib file. In fact, it's just empty. And what I did was, first off, we'll talk about the order that I implemented things. So we'll talk about the front page, this plus page.svelte. This is our front end, right? Plus page.svelte is front end in Svelte land. Whatever route it is, it's on your front end, basically. And here, what we're doing is I'm going to skip some of this code up here just to explain the UI first, right? Because UI makes more sense to humans, right? We have some Svelte syntax, just HTML, right? Here's our header, Kintone, Oauth 2.0, and you can see it up there, right? And then I have some error stuff. If there's an error, display that error. And here we have a big if statement, right? Very cool, right? Big if statement. And basically it says, like, if you're not logged in, then display a big red button that says login with Kintone. And when you click it, do the login function. And if you are already authenticated, right, you don't need to log in again. In fact, you need to maybe log out. It'll say you are logged in. And then if you click it again, it'll log you out, right? And then beneath that, if we are authenticated as well, we're authenticated with Kintone, let's get some records data from Kintone as well, right? So I have another button that appears if you're authenticated, and it says get some Kintone records. And when you click it, it runs a function called get records. Cool. And then we have another area, right? Record data. And right now it says no records to display, right? Makes sense. I haven't done anything yet. But basically, when we get our Kintone data, that is a reactive variable using the Svelte 5 syntax of the state variable. And basically, we're going through and we're going to loop through. And each loop in Svelte is written like this. And in reactive, it'd be like map. You'd map through your array. Here we have for each Kintone data as a record in our database with a key of record.id.value. Just display the product name, which I had in my database as product name, product price, product description, right? So just display one of those for each record in my database. Otherwise, if there's no data, just say there's no records. So you should click and get some records, right? Okay, then what does our login look like? What does our logout look like? What does that get records look like? So we'll talk about that next, right? And then I'll go into this kind of on mount and some design choices that maybe if I was going to redo this from scratch and make it really clean and dry code, then maybe I'd change some things as well. So here's our login function. So when you click login, it's going to run the login function. Wow, right? it's going to make a fetch request to our backend. This is the SvelteKit backend, and the route is at /API/ you can name that whatever you want. Just make sure you change the route as well. We're going to make a post request, and we're just for now sending along this redirect URI. Probably if I was going to redo this, you don't need to send the redirect URI here. It's env variable, right? We have this in our .env file. It's not going to change. So really, I probably should have just had this declared in the backend and done that. I don't know why I sent it along. I don't know. I was being lazy. And we're going to wait for that fetch request, right? It's async function. So we're going to wait for the response. If the response is not okay, we're going to do an error thing. And what we're going to get back is what's called a authorization URL, right? And then we're going to send our window to that authorization URL. We're going to navigate the user to a different screen, right? So that's step one of our Oauth flow, right? We're making an authorization request, and the browser is actually going to go all the way over here, and it's going to show the Kintone window, right? So if I do this right here and click, it's actually going to say, okay, are you going to authenticate this app? That's what that is. It's going to first make that redirect all the way over to the Kintone and say, okay, are you going to authenticate this request, right? So that's what that is. So we're getting back our authorization URL. And I will show you the back end after this. I just like to start from the front end, right? It makes sense for people who are newer to web dev concepts. And also it makes sense for me too. What am I talking about? I've been doing this for five years-ish. I'm not that great, but it just makes sense to start from the front end, right? So I have a login function. I have my logout function up above that, and it's pretty much the same. We're going to send a request to my backend, and we're going to send with the delete method this time instead of the post method, right? And if you log out, then you logged out, right? And we changed our is authenticated variable back to false, for example. So that's what that is. And then you might be asking, what is this handle callback, right? What is handle callback here? A callback, right, if you're new to that programming term, is a function that runs when the first one completes, right? So you're able to have what they call like success callbacks or failure callbacks. So if this function succeeds, you should do this. And if it fails, then you should do this, for example, right? It's a cool design pattern from a little bit back in the day when they didn't really have very verbose async await functionality, right? You had to do your callbacks, await promises and do callbacks, right? Nowadays, we just do async, await, do this. It's a little bit more simple these days, but yes, we have this callback. And what that callback is, when we are authenticating, I'm going to log out, I'm going to log in one more time. So I'm going to click allow in just a second here, and it's going to send me back to mywebsite.com. mywebsite.com/success or mywebsite.com/myaccount or whatever I specified in my redirect. So when that redirect hits, I want to be able to detect it. And the way that I went about this time, just because I was trying to keep my number of routes and everything as minimal as possible. In this callback, when the user visits this page, this callback is actually going to run every single time the window opens, basically. And what this callback is looking for is it's going to look for if the URL sent back to me has a code and a state in it. And what that means, if you look right here, you can see like in my Oauth request up here at the browser, I apologize, it's so small, but you can see that there's a lot of information added to that. And when I get sent back to my Kintone app as well, you could see it for 1 second, but it did exist, right? It did say like localhost 5173 ? And then code equals blah, 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 and state equals blah, 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 error param equals blah, blah. It's good practice to delete those if you don't need them. And we actually use the replace state tool from SvelteKit in order to do that. You could leave it in there. It's not very cool to have a mega long URL with a bunch of code-ish information in there, but you could do that. So what we're going to do is every time we open this page, every time this component mounts, we're going to look in the URL. And if there's some params like code, state, and blah, 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 then we're going to handle this callback. Basically, what this is saying is this callback will only run the second time the user navigates back, when they get redirected back from the Oauth provider, right? That function, actually, if I do logout and I just refresh the page much time, that is not going to run. That code is not going to run because our URL does not have a state or a code or anything in there like that. Right? It is only when I get redirected back to my web application with Kintone, you saw it again right there just for a second, that we have code and state and all these variables that Kintone sent back to us, and then we run our callback, right? Because if you remember, the Oauth Flow, it's 2 steps, right? The first thing that we did right here is we had our authorization request, and that navigated us to Kintone or whatever our service is, and you had to click, hey, allow this application to do blah, blah, blah. It's sending back an authorization code to my web app. We have to do something with that authorization code, right? In this case, we want to get an access token so we can make some API requests. If you're not going to be doing anything with the database at all, you're just using this to validate the user, make sure that the user is a valid Kintone user, or if you're using another OAuth provider, the GitHub or Google, right? You're just making sure that they're a user, then you don't have to do anything past this point. We authenticated, right? They're a user, right? I entered my username and password and I got back an authorization code. We're done, right? But we are going to actually be using this OAuth authorization code to get an access token. That token is going to be used to be able to make API requests with all of my permissions and all of my scopes that I have available to my user, right? So that is why we have this callback function. And this callback function is also just going to make another request to our auth backend, which I will show you in a minute. And if that response is successful, then we're changing is authenticated to true, and we're getting rid of all those ugly URL params using this replace state. I don't know if I have to do it. Let me just try and get rid of that real quick, and we'll see what it looks like. I'll log out, log back in. Yeah, you can see like my URL up here has like code is equal to blah, 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 and my state is equal to blah, blah. I'll tell you what state is in just a little bit. It's just good practice to clean up. And if I also like refresh the page, right? So like I have this code is equal to blah, blah, blah. And let's say the user like clicks refresh, it'll say like invalid state parameter and stuff like that. It starts to bug out. And this because we use the state variable in order to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. We have a super secret code that we have created on our backend. I'll show you in just a second. And we send that in our request. And then when the request comes back, if the state's not matching, ooh, someone tried to intercept our request, right? That's the basic idea. So if the user has that extra information remaining in the URL and they click the refresh button, they'll be like, hey, that state parameter, that's an old one. It doesn't match anymore. And then you get this error and they're like, oh, my login doesn't work. So it is best practice to clear these out of the URL. So that's why I have that. And our get records request, I'll talk about this last, but this is probably the most simple part of this. We're just making a fetch request to our own API. I have a route here called get records, and it runs in the backend as well. When you're making API requests to your database, it has to be on the backend. Remember that. So if you're using Svelte and plus server.js or something on the server, if you're using express.js, you have to do it from that backend or a node backend as well. And that's a good point to start opening up our backend. Let's go into the long-awaited auth route right here. And there's a lot of kind of code-ish stuff going on here. But so what we have here is we have our .env files being imported, right? You always want to import those in the server side so the user doesn't have access to those. That's best practice. So we have our client ID and our secret. We have a couple of URLs that didn't need to be .env variables, but it makes life easier. And I have a helper function that this one's, to be honest, is AI generated. I did not do this myself. I could look it up, I guess, but why would I do that? This one is just encoding URI parameters into base 64. That's all. And we have here in our auth backend route, we have 2 routes. So we have 2 kind of methods that we've enabled. We have post, and then if we scroll all the way down, I'm going to get rid of this real quick. If we scroll all the way down, we also have the get route, and then we have a delete route as well. I'm not sure if this get route's being used actually right now. This might be a leftover from when I was testing. Maybe I'll double check that. But this delete route is for our logout functionalities, right? And you can see a hint about how we're handling authentication. We're using HTTP cookies in order to do this. And we're deleting the cookie when we log out, right? So here's our backend. I'm going to talk about this post request now, because the post request is where our login function is making a fetch request to, and also our callback function is making a request to, right? And this, I did it with a big if. You could have separated these files out. You could have an auth endpoint and like a token endpoint, right? Or something like that. One for just verifying the user, one for getting an access token. That's totally cool too. I did it all in one file, but you could definitely separate those concerns. And the very first thing that we do is we look at our request body and we see if we have a code in there, right? Going back to our front end, you can see in our login function, right? We're making that post request. The first time that we do it, it just has a redirect that maybe I didn't even need. It does not have a code in there. It is only on the second time, right? After we've validated in Kintone, we've got our authorization code and our state and all that stuff, that we need to then make our second request to our authentication backend. So it is the second one that is the callback, right? So right up here, I could almost put like a handle callback function or something like that, just so I know. And if our body has a code, if our request body has a code in it, then we need to get a token. And I think I'll talk about this second, because really in the logic of the flow, right, the first thing that we do is we log in first, right? So let me talk about this else before I talk about the if, so to speak. So what we need to do when we are sending along some information, right, we need a idea, and this is very common for any kind of OAuth flow, is we need an idea of state. And what that state means is it is like a temporary, think 5 minute, not even 5 minute, like one use variable that you create randomly. And that variable is basically used as like a secret code between you and the OAuth application that nothing has changed from when you sent the request to when it came back. So we are just creating like a random state variable here. And this is all, I looked all this stuff up. It's not something that I would code out by myself at all. But we are creating like this basic like random state, and we are going to send it along with our request. And this is according also to the API specs of Kintone as well. You can see right here on the example request, right, it has a state. A random value in order to prevent CSRF, cross-origin, man-in-the-middle attacks, as defined in the OAuth 2.0 specifications. State 1 is not a very secure state, but you could do that as well. It could be like ABC123 if you want. Don't do that, right? And we need to send that along with our request. And when Kintone redirects back to our application the first time, it's also going to include that state parameter in the URL. You can see up here, it's very small, but you can see like state is equal to blah, blah, blah. Here it is. That will change every time, right? And the state should only be used once. So once it's been used, it gets invalidated, and you cannot just resend the same request with an old state, right? Because what if someone was like looking at your screen and they had superpowers and they could memorize this random value real fast, and then they tried to log in with your state variable, right? That wouldn't work, right? We need to create that state variable, and we're going to send that along. And we need a way to save that state variable just in case there's navigation away from the page. Here we're using cookies in order to do that, and we get rid of them later. And the last thing that we do is after making our authorization, we create this authorization URL, and we do all this stuff in the back end, and then we send it back to our front end, right? And I think if I was like remaking this app with a little bit more knowledge, maybe I would have had this be like a plus page .server.svelte, which is a cool thing in SvelteKit that you can do to have server-side code running. It's like a hybrid between the front end and back end, right? And if I had done that, maybe I wouldn't have needed to make this kind of large if statement in my back end. I could have just created the authorization endpoint URL, and then I could have, sent that to my front end, right? It's like what we're doing at the very end of things is all we're doing is we're taking this authorization URL that we created using our super secret M variables, and we're moving the window to it as well. This has the benefits of we're using N variables to guard our secret. So it's not available in our front-end code, but at the very end of things, like at the end of the day, it is being sent to the window.location.href. So it does appear up here in your URL, for example, right? So if I reload the page, it is appearing up there. So it is being sent to and from the front end as well. So I think I would do that a little bit differently, but for today's purposes, it's totally fine. Hindsight, right? So that is our first part of our authentication flow, right? We're being redirected back after this successful authorization request. We say, okay, that is a valid authorization URL, right? And it has our super secret information, and we did log in, so it knows that it's us. We have our state is matching. Our state is not matching yet, but we did send along a state. We get approved in order to browse some records or add some records or whatever it is. And then the user will be re-navigated back to the redirect endpoint URL, right? This is the part where we get back to our application, right? Website.com, or in this case, localhost. And our URL params have my redirect URL, and then it has code, and then it has state, right? That code is what we want, right? That code is our authorization code. It says, hey, this person is a legit user. They logged in, and they have the ability to do XYZ. We use this authorization code in order to get an access token, and then we use the access token to make fetch requests to our database. The authorization code expires in 10 minutes, right? You have to redo this if you don't use it immediately, right? But this is the only time that you use the authorization code, right? We don't keep the authorization code itself hanging around, right? We only keep our access token, right? Because the authorization code is very valuable information, right? Because that is what authenticates the user to say, hey, I'm allowed to do blah, 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 right? This access token right here is what we save in our cookies. And we save it as an HTTP cookie. But yeah, we don't go around saving the authorization code. All right, so we get redirected to the Kintone. We get redirected back, and our URL has a code and a state in it, right? And now we're going to take this code and state, and we're going to send it back to our backend one more time. And that is where the first part of our post request here happens. If our request body has a code this time, okay, this is our second request. So they must have authorized once. Let's check to see if they can get a access token now, right? And the first thing that we're going to do is, remember, we sent along our state. We need a way to save that state. You can use like local storage and stuff like that. I did it with cookies. So we saved it temporarily to some cookies in order to verify the code and the state. And if it doesn't match, then, for example, they're reusing a state variable from a long time ago or something like that, right? So it's an invalid state parameter. They're doing something funny. But if it does match, then you are able to just delete those immediately, right? We don't use those after this because the state is matching, so it's fine, right? And we don't want to keep excess information lying around. So the next thing that we do is we send another fetch request to our token endpoint. And this is where we finally get our access token. This is also just according to the Kintone specs. So I have my access token. I send a post request to the /OAuth2/token, and I send my authorization code, right? This is the very important authorization code that we just got. And please give me a authorization or a access token. Here's my credentials, and then redirect me back to my application one more time. And so what we do now is in our code, we send the fetch request, a post request to that endpoint. That token endpoint that was told to us by our settings in Kintone, right? Here's our token endpoint right here. This is where we get the token, right? I didn't make that myself or anything like that, for example. And our body is just all the information that Kintone says it wants. So we have our authorization code, we have our code, we have our redirect URI, we have our ID, for example, our secret, and a verifier for the code. And if everything's okay, then we'll get back a response. And that response that gets sent back, if we also check the documentation one more time, it will give us here the access token, right? And this will allow you to run APIs for 1 hour, which is another cool feature of OAuth, right? It has a time limit on it as well, which is really cool. And then in order to expand past that time limit, right, you need to use a refresh token, which is a little bit of a different concept that we'll be talking about today. But for now, we have an access token that is valid for 1 hour, right? And we are saving this as a TTP cookie, which is a very modern and secure way of saving this access token, right? And you can also see this if we go back to our application. It's going to be small. But if you open up the developer tools, which you're unable to zoom in on, unfortunately, squint on your screen or just trust me. Go to application, and you'll see over here in storage, you'll see cookies. Oops, I accidentally went back and forward. If you go to cookies right here, you can see that I have an access token cookie. And it has a value of blah, blah, blah. And it has an expiration date, right? So the browser handles expiration, as well as these check marks here, HTTP only, and also this is secure. And having a check mark in secure is always good. I gave this cookie on accident a max age of 1 week. This access token is not available for 1 week, right? It's actually, according to the documentation, it's 1 hour. It'll stick around in your browser for 1 week, but when you try and use it in the authentication flow, it'll say, hey, this cookie is invalid anyways. If you want to be very strict and proper about these sort of things, then maybe change this to 1 hour, right? And then we have our cookie saved in the browser, so we don't need to return the cookie or anything like that. We set our cookies on the back end, and we just return a simple success is equal to true. And then where are we checking this cookie, right? Like how are we making sure that this cookie exists and like our user is logged in, right? Because you'll notice like when I refresh the page, I'm still logged in. And in Svelte, they have this idea of layout.svelte or layout.server.js. A layout file is a template file that applies to many different routes. There's different ways of going about this in different frameworks. So you'll have to check out how to do this in your framework of choice. But the way I do here in this layout.server.js, and this is on the main route. So actually this file will apply to all of my other files and routes, basically. And what I'm saying is like when you load this page, check the cookies, and if they have an access token, and if they don't have it, then return when you load the page this JSON that says is authenticated is equal to the status, a double Boolean negation, right? This is a little bit of fancy JavaScript, but basically it means the Boolean status is a true or false of access token. And so that happens automatically when I load the page. I just need to set up using this Svelte 5 syntax now. And the way that you do it in Svelte 5 is using this $props, blah, blah, blah. And the way that you would have done it before that I'm very used to is export let data, and you would have been done, right? That is not allowed anymore. It'll give you a big red squiggly line if you're using runes mode. The way that you do it now is data is equal to props. And the idea is that it was difficult to tell like when things are loaded in as props and when they are, I think is the reasoning behind it. And there's also probably some stuff behind the screens that I'm not smart enough to really understand. But the way that you do it now is with $props. You can also pass in props here as well into the function. So that seems pretty powerful, right? Don't be scared of the props. You just change it to export let to $props. And then what I have is here that data variable that gets passed into our page, right? Because it's getting passed in from our .layout.server.js, or if you're on a different route, maybe plus page.js, for example, or plus page.server.js in Svelte. We have our isAuthenticated variable, and this is what used to be just basically a basic reactive variable, right? And this is what people were like grumbling about when Svelte 5 got announced and they showed this off. You would have just done authenticated. You would have just done this in the past, right? And let is authenticated equals false. And then later on in your code, you could be like is authenticated equals true. And it would have been automatically reactive, right? Which is pretty cool. Not the case anymore. But what you have to do is declare something to have state. And this apparently solves a lot of problems behind the scenes. So yeah, good for them, sure. It is a little bit more, you have to type a little bit more, but I got used to it. So you can too, right? It's fine. So you have this state, and I'm setting is authenticated equal to the state of data.isAuthenticated. So this is the part where it makes my application reactive, because I'm getting back my state. I'm checking it every time I load the page. Right now I'm not. I go back and the state changes, right? I'm saying, hey, this person's logged in now, and now it's displaying all this other stuff, right? So I had to set it to state data.isAuthenticated, right? And this is getting passed back from my server, my layout.server.js. They're checking to see, hey, does this person have an access token? Are they logged in? You know, depending on your application, you might just want to check their authorization token, right? Although that only lasts for 10 minutes. So you'd probably have in your application a separate kind of like logged in state that you would check. Here I just did the access token because we're going to be opening up our application, making some API requests, and then logging out, right? So we have our access token is being checked right there, right? And the other part of this application now is just fetching data using our token. So we have our Kintone data is also equal to a empty array, a stateful empty array. And we get this via the getRecords function. And that is just making a fetch request to our backend at /API/getRecords. This is the least interesting, probably part of the video, to be honest. We have our getRecords function right here. And we are using our access token that we have saved. This is the cool part as well. I know I just said it's the least interesting part, but this is actually pretty cool. I apologize. We have our access token. We are making a fetch request to our database. If you're not using Kintone, I wonder maybe why you're using Oauth to log in, but you would have to do this with a API token for some other service, but we are authenticated in Kintone. We have a Kintone access token. We're making a fetch request to Kintone using our token. And this is all we have to do right here. Instead of doing a Saibozu API token, like our documentation says, something like this is equal to my token, blah, 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 blah. Instead, we just have this header, authorization bearer is equal to the access token. And that'll allow us to fetch our record data from the app that we specified. And if my Kintone user is not allowed to view this app, then this will get denied. And if they are, then they're allowed to fetch the records. I return the record data just as JSON. I await the data and I return it. And then my silly products from my store, whatever it is that I'm getting in my application gets returned. This is just the beginning of Oauth 2.0, and using HTTP cookies and JSON web tokens, for example, is the new hot buzzword. But don't be afraid of integrating your own authentication, right? You're not rolling your own auth. You are just integrating an existing service's authentication, which is very powerful. And especially if you're going to be using that application, right? If it's Google Cloud, right? Or if it's AWS, for example, or in this case, Kintone, or for example, Firebase, Supabase, whatever, right? If you're going to be authenticating a user and then using data that user has access to in that service, it's very powerful to use Oauth 2.0. So I want to thank you for listening to this video. Hopefully I'll be able to cut it down in size a little bit. I did ramble a little bit, but I hope this is very helpful, and good job everybody listening to the end, and go explore a little bit with Oauth 2.0 and Svelte 5. It's not bad to develop with, in my opinion. Definitely check that out. Thank you very much for listening today. This is Sean with the Kintone team, and I hope you have a good day or night wherever you are. Peace.